Hi, I'm Rita Fischel, and I've designed a pattern using the Creative Grid Storm at Sea ruler. The pattern is sized from a wall hanging up to a queen size. It uses this ruler, which is the Cgrsas. This ruler made it very simple and very quick to do this quilt, which sometimes intimidates people by the illusion of movement in it. It's just a combination of squares and triangles. Everything that is pieced into the top of this quilt has been cut with this ruler. It's very useful in a classroom situation. You begin by choosing dark and light combinations of fabrics, and you can do two colors or you can do blended, as this pattern is here. And the first block I'll start with is this diamond in a rectangle. To do this, I find myself a light fabric. I cut it 4.5 inches wide, and after I've cut it, you'll see I seamed it across the top and the bottom, making it kind of a pocket. Now I lay the ruler on the stitched strip, and I'm going to cut these triangles, the large triangles, all the way across. And this little knuckle here allows me to get all the way across the fabric. So now I've got my triangles. Now I'm going to take my stitches out across the top of my triangle point, and when I open it up, I press the seam open, and that's going to be my diamond shape for my diamond in a rectangle. Now I want to do the triangles that I add to the four sides to make it into a rectangle. So I'm starting with another 4.5 inch strip. Again, I'm cutting it with the ruler. And these are the shapes that I'm cutting. So after I cut my strip, I simply lay I have a straight edge along one side, and I lay my template shapes on my strip, and I rotary cut along the edge of those template shaped triangles, and I get these triangle shapes. I would go all the way across the strip cutting those. Now I take those triangle shapes, and when I sew them, using 1/4 inch seam allowance, I sew them diagonally opposite of each other first, press the seams towards those new triangles, then I go back and I sew the remaining 2 triangles on, and again I press the seams away from that center diamond so that it lays nice and flat, and I've got my first shape. I only have 2 more shapes. I have a large square within a square within a square, and then I have a small, the same, square within a square within a square. To make the 2 different sizes of the square within a square within a square, you begin with your center blocks. Again, you're using a light colored fabric. For the small square, you're going to cut 2.5 inch strips and cut them into 2.5 inch squares. Again, you can see that everything is illustrated on this ruler. For the large square, you start with a 4.5 inch strip and you cut it into 4.5 inch squares. To complete this first trip around the square, you're going to now use dark fabric. And it tells you in the pattern how to do this, but for the small square, you're going to cut a 3.25 inch square from a 3.25 inch strip, and then you cut the square like an X, and you get 4 triangles. Once you've cut this apart, let's lay it down here so you can see what I was talking about. Just like that. Now to sew it together, you sew 1 triangle on opposite sides of the square, press your seams towards the triangle, and then go back and do the other triangles. And again, press your seams towards the triangles away from the center block, and that gives you your first square and a square and a square. You're going to do the same thing with your larger square, but you're beginning with a 5.25 inch square for your first trip around, and that's the one that you would cut like an X. And that will finish off your larger square and a square block, just as your first smaller one was. Now you need to go around one more time to complete this unit, and you need lighter fabric again. I'm just using white because it's easy to see here. For my smaller square, I'm going to add to this piece block here, and I start with a 2 7/8, actually 2 7/8 inch squares, and with these I'm going to cut them in half one time. The reason the cutting is figured in this manner is because we are trying to keep the grain line being non-biased when you're finished. Because I cut this like an X, the 4 sides are now along the outside of your square in a square, and these are straight grain. Then when I've done the second cutting and I sew these along, this is bias and this is straight grain. So when you sew this whole thing together now, your square in a square in a square is all done with straight grain. To do the larger one, it's the same exact method, but you're using a different amount of fabric. You're cutting 2 squares 4 7/8 inch, and again you're cutting them in half diagonally once, both of them. And just as before, you sew them on opposite sides, you press your seams away from the center towards those new triangles, and then you do the remaining 2 sides. And those are the 3 units that are used to make up this entire pattern. It goes together easily, it goes together efficiently, and everything lines up because all of your 1/4 inch seams are figured in and you're working with straight grain fabric.